Okay, well, shalom, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining me for this special shiur titled Fear, Faith, Faith, Fear, and Prayer in Times of Danger, the Tira prayer, how we spiritually wrestle with fear, and how to harness our faith in times of danger. I'm Rabbi Johnny Solomon, the Chief Learning Officer at WebYeshiva.org. Thank you so much for joining those who are joining us live and those who are going to be listening to this shir as a recording. If you're interested in WebYeshiva.org's offerings in terms of halacha mastery, our different classes and courses, please visit our website. If you're interested in my online spiritual coaching and halachic consultation session, known as the Virtual Rabbi, please visit our website, and there you can find out about that service. Today, we're going to talk about a prayer and the meaning of that prayer and how it speaks to us in these times. Those of us who have joined this class, wherever you may be based, we are in the middle of really a war within a war. We are still within a war that started on October 8th, 2023. We still have hostages who need to come home. We still have bodies of Jews who need to be buried with the appropriate rites and with the kavod that they're due. We're also in a war with Iran. There was a preemptive strike against a country who basically wished to demolish the state of Israel. And as a result, obviously, they have fought back, and many of us have been sleeping in safe rooms or having disturbed nights. And so I very much appreciate all of those who are joining us here. And our task today is to try and make sense of those feelings of faith, fear, and prayer in times of danger. For sure, we're in times of danger. Sadly, Jews and non-Jews in the state of Israel have lost their lives in the past few days. The ballistic missiles being sent by Iran are huge and are scary, and we all need to listen to whatever guidelines Picud HaOref are giving us. That being said, our function today is to learn together and grow together. And so that's what we're going to do right now. And we're going to reflect on a prayer which I don't know if any of you do say, but perhaps this year will inspire you to say. It's a prayer known as Al Tira, which appears after Aleinu in most Sidurim. So just as a quick kind of brief survey, is anybody of you here somebody who regularly says the Al Tira prayer? Anyone? Don't have to, but curious? So far, no one said yes.
I don't, but I know there's a Gehillah in Manchester. I think the Hale community, they say Al Tira, but I've not.
The Hale community, not only do they, but I was there the Shabbat when they instituted it. But yes, they do. But many communities don't. And it seems to be that many individuals don't. Although if you open a Siddur, most Siddurim do have this prayer appended to the Aleinu prayer. Aleinu we have at the end of the three daily services, Shachar, Mincha, and Mariv. And so we have instructions, or at least observations that some congregations add or some individuals add this prayer. Now, I'm going to call it a prayer, but really it is a fusion of three verses. And we're going to learn about these verses. One is from Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, and two are from the book of Yeshayahu. And we're going to talk about how this prayer came into being, what it represents, and perhaps what we can draw from it. But at the very least, we have in the screen in front of us, some congregations add, or some individuals add, this prayer of three verses. Amen. Have no fear of sudden terror, of the ruin that overtakes the wicked. Devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. When you grow old, I will still be the same. When your hair turns gray, I will still carry you. I made you, I will bear you, I will carry you, and I will rescue you. And so we have three verses which have been brought together, put together in some kind of mini prayer, which are appended to the end of the Aleinu prayer. Obviously, we need to wonder, what's the connection between Aleinu and these verses, why these verses were brought together, and what's the intention of this prayer itself. And that's really our focus for our learning today, hopefully by also drawing divrei chizuk from these three verses. Now, if you want to know the history of certain prayers, there are various different books or siddurim which give some kind of guidance about where these prayers came from. In terms of the Al Tira prayer, it's not found in the Midrash or in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Obviously, these are three biblical verses. But in terms of them being brought together as some kind of tefillah, they're not mentioned in the classic rabbinic works and necessarily even the later rabbinic works. Instead, this seems to be something that which was adopted but was inspired by a Midrash. One of the first sources which relate to this prayer of Al Tira in terms of its origins is Be'er's Avodat Yisrael, which is a Siddur with explanations about the history of prayers. And Be'er says as follows: Psukim ele einam bekitve yad v'sfarim yishanim. These three verses as a prayer to be said in the daily prayers are not found in the ancient manuscripts or older Siddurim that we have, meaning this isn't something that we seem to know from the earlier practices of Jewish liturgy. However, it seems to be, he says, that this was adopted based on the recommendation or observation of a sefer called Zichron Zion, which I don't know much about, but that itself made reference to a midrash on Midrash Esther Rabbah, which tells us an interesting story. And so now Be'er tells us an abridged version of the midrash, which explains perhaps why this prayer came to being, although it doesn't necessarily tell us why this is mentioned after Aleinu. And so I'm going to tell you the abridged version of the midrash, and we're going to see the fuller version quite soon. Be'er mentions Paga Mordechai begimel tinokot. It tells us, this is coming from the midrash on Megillat Esther, the Mordechai bumped into three young kids who were going out from school, Yotzim Bet Rabban. Amar lehem amur li psukeichem. He said, tell me the verses you've learned today. The first child referenced the first verse of Al Tira from the book of Mishlei, chapter 3. The second related the second verse from Yeshayahu, chapter 8. And the third related the third verse, actually from later on. And Mordechai was happy that they had related such good news. That's what Be'er says. That's the history, according to him, of this prayer. By the way, the reference there in Be'er was incorrect. That's actually Yeshayahu Mem Vav, the third verse. So we have these three verses which form a prayer which is said after Aleinu, which we're not quite sure when this started to be said. It's referenced in Avodat Yisrael, citing Zichron Zion, which mentions a midrash where these three verses are brought together, but no reference is made to Aleinu, or necessarily at which point this became a thing. Still, the midrash on Esther tells us that these three verses somehow have something to do with a story involving Mordechai and three young children. Now, before we go on, I want to pause and ask you, do you have any questions about what I've said so far? Okay. So we already read the translation, but I want to just focus a little bit more and explain these three verses. So the first one comes from Mishlei, written by Shlomo Melech. And Mishlei tells us, Al tira mipachad pitom, have no fear of sudden terror, unexpected, things that frighten you. Masa'od rasha'im ki tavo, or the ruin, in fact the word sho'ah comes from that word, that overtakes the wicked. Shlomo Melech is telling us that we shouldn't be scared about sudden punishments, of which the like, which are directed towards wicked people. Wicked people will suffer, and we shouldn't be afraid of sudden terrors of the like that wicked people may experience. You may well say, why does Shlomo Melech say that? It seems to be that sometimes people do get scared that the fate of others may befall them. And so he says, there's a Jewish way of handling fear, which is, if you don't think it's relevant to you, you don't need to be worrying about it. Al tira mipachad pitom, and especially if there are things which you think may just come upon you unexpectedly, that's not something you should be worrying about. That's that verse. Obviously, there's lots of commentary about that. The Malbim discusses this verse, the Vilna Gaon, etc. But what it seems to be saying is good people shouldn't worry that they may experience the kind of difficulties and sudden challenges which befall wicked people. That's verse 1. Verse 2 comes from Yeshayahu chapter 8, where we're told, devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. This is referring to wicked people. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. You can try and do harm to us, but God is with us, and all your efforts will come to nothing. That's the second verse. And then the third verse of the Tira prayer tells us as follows. When you grow old, I don't know why it's talking about growing old, but we'll explain it in a second. I will still be the same, seemingly God. When your hair turns gray, I will still carry you. I made you, I will bear you, I will carry you, and I will rescue you. Now, if you took these three verses, you may not necessarily think that they have any connection to each other. Each carry a certain kind of tone of reassurance. But beyond that, what is the connection between the three? Why would we jump in a prayer from one verse in Mishlei to another in Yeshayahu to another in Yeshayahu? What is it got to do with Aleinu? Why would we be saying it at that point in time at the end of the service? And why is there a need for this kind of reassurance? Any quick thoughts before we proceed?
Maybe because at the end of the service, you're going back out into the current world.
Beautiful. Brilliant. I said it's the end of Aleinu, but we're going to see a source which says this prayer is said before people leave the shul, meaning it's not so much its association with the final prayer, but it's association with you about to walk out to the wider world, where there is often a lot more worries and fears about what may be and what one may encounter. So this is almost considered to be a sgula, right? Some kind of protective prayer before you leave shul, before you end your prayers. It's almost a tfilat haderech of sort, to say, whatever happens today, don't worry, God's going to be with you, God will carry you, God will look after you, which is actually a really lovely idea. We think about tfilat haderech when you go on a journey, but every day we go on a journey. Sometimes we go on a journey from our lounge to our kitchen, sometimes from our home to our office, sometimes to go and see friends or family, but we're always doing things, or always traveling in some way or another. And so one way to understand this prayer is it's a spiritual tfilat haderech, to give us reassurance that it's going to be okay. And that itself, by the way, if we said nothing more, it's a very, very beautiful thing. I talked about me being a spiritual coach. This is us spiritually coaching ourselves by reminding us that God is with us. Don't be afraid. The enemies that plan to harm us, God will thwart their plans. And God will be with us. God doesn't age. God will carry us, and God will rescue us. It's actually such a beautiful prayer. It almost makes us wonder, how is it that this is in, I assume, all of our Sidurim? And by the way, I wasn't making any criticism. I don't always say this, but I've been starting to say it more. But it's such a beautiful meditation, right? Such a lovely thing. And it's right there. And it's basically, like I said, a tfilat haderech for our daily life. What I want to do now is make a little bit more sense of this source. And to do that, we need to go to the origin of these three verses, not the origins in Mishlei and Yeshayahu, but the origin which brings them together, which is the Midrash Esther Rabbah, right? The Midrash on Megillat Esther, like Ben mentioned in Avodat Israel, and this is the full text. And I want us to tell the story as is recorded there and try and make sense of what Mordechai gets from these three verses, and perhaps what we're supposed to think about in terms of when we recite these three verses. So the Midrash says as follows. Okay, I'm just going to move this box a little bit elsewhere. It says, when Haman made a decree to demolish the Jewish people, to wipe out the Jewish nation. What did he do? Wrote these letters to command people on this day, at this time, you're going to go out and you're going to kill the Jews. And how did he feel at the time? Well, he was thrilled. He'd made a plan, right? He was thrilled, and so were all his friends. And when Haman and his friends are walking through Shushan, they encounter Mordechai, who was walking in front of them. And what does Mordechai then see? They see Mordechai. Mordechai sees 3 kids who've just left their school, young children, Tinokot Bet Rabban. And what does Mordechai do? He runs after them, and Haman, curious as he was, he and his merry men run after Mordechai to figure out what's he doing, what does he want to talk to these young kids about? You can see already it's a bit of a cryptic midrash. Haman has just made this decree. He's happy as Larry. He sees Mordechai. Mordechai sees 3 children. He's obviously been made aware of what's about to be determined. And he then runs after these 3 children to ask them something. What does he want to ask them? It says here the following. He says, basically recite to me the verse that you studied in today's class. At that point, that's all you studied. He asked the child, what verse did you learn today in Cheder? The child says, that first verse. Don't be afraid by sudden danger or basically by the kind of punishments that wicked people receive. The second child says, Mordechai, I also learned a different verse, and this is what I learned. You will make plans to try and destroy the Jewish nation, but they won't stand, and God will thwart them. God says, I'm going to be with you till you get old, or till I get old. We're going to get to that in a second. I'm going to be with you, I'm going to save you, and I'm going to rescue you. And having heard these 3 verses, he laughed and he was delighted. Haman turns to Mordechai and says, why are you so happy? You should be miserable. These kids reminded me that I shouldn't be afraid about the plans you made against me and my nation. And he says, basically, the first group of people that I'm going to go after are the children. Because the children reminded Mordechai of hope, and I'm a person who is anti-hope. Now, if you've heard this midrash, great. If you haven't, this is perhaps a surprising, refreshing, inspiring midrash. But here we have these 3 verses which form the Tira prayer, which Mordechai hears from 3 different children, perhaps walking together in Shushan, the day in which the decree against Am Yisrael has been signed and sealed by Haman. Just as a quick aside, tonight is Chaf Gimel Sivan, which is a day in which that decree was annulled. So we're at a very, very auspicious time in the Jewish calendar, Chaf Gimel Sivan. But at this point, the decree has been made, but Mordechai gains inspiration and hope from the verses that he hears the children reciting. And this is the basis for the Al Tira prayers, meaning when you open a Siddur, so I'm going to go back again, when you open a Siddur and it says at the end of Aleinu, some congregations add, you wouldn't think this is anything to do with Mordechai and children and annihilation, but it's everything to do with Mordechai and children and annihilation. It's about hope, it's about danger, about fear. It's about believing that even though we may be in difficult times, God is with us. That's what this prayer is. That's what the Al Tira prayer is. That's where it comes from in terms of this compilation of 3 verses from different parts of the Tanakh. So before we go on, I want to ask you, do you have any questions about this midrash?
Seems strange that the children would all be bringing verses that are not together. Maybe I'm just assuming they were sitting in the same class.
Right. Well, seemingly they weren't sitting in the same class. Or the other thing, I mean, it seems to be, especially from the second who says more, the verse that I learned today is perhaps it was that they would divide up the Tanakh and different children would learn different things. Or perhaps they were learning a lot of Tanakh, but each child connected to a different verse. But I agree. I mean, there are three children in Tinokot who are Tinokot Shel Rabban, and one is from Mishlei, one is from early on in Yeshaya, one is from later on. But that, I think, is a mystique of the prayer, that somehow these verses clearly come together. Or maybe there was a shir that the Rav was giving, right? The teacher was giving about fear and danger that day, which itself is obviously fascinating. And they were quoting different verses from the Tanakh. And one child said, I was asked to read this verse in class. And the other child says, I was asked to read this verse in class, meaning perhaps that's how it worked out.
But they may not be the same age. I mean, isn't anyone below 6 a tinok?
I suppose so, yeah. Right, there could have been different ages of children. We're not told exactly, and they seem to have slightly different responses in the opening words that they say to Mordechai. Yeah, sorry.
If Haman is happy with his friends that he's got the decree, he's got his dates, and what he's going to do, why is he rushing after Mordechai? Does it mean that he's rushing after Mordechai say that there's some insecurity inside Haman? You would think he would just ignore it. He'd just ignore Mordechai. But I suppose it's because the Megillah is trying to tell us there's this any antagonism that Haman has for Mordechai. He's got to know everything that Mordechai is doing, even though at this time he should be happy.
Well, I agree, but more than that, just think about the punchline. It's not meant to be a punchline. It's actually a tragedy of the final line of the Medrash, which he says, because of what Mordechai has just told me, when I'm going to give it to the Jews, I'm going to start with the children. I mean, that's a kind of sick and cynical behavior of our worst enemies since the beginning of our time. You know, what have the children done? They've just quoted some verses. It's what they represent.
But
They
Haman's not
represent
the
hope.
first one. Haman's not the first one who went after the kids first. Look at Paro.
Right. We're going to come to that. We're going to come to Amalek in a second, right? Meaning he's following in well-trodden footsteps of the kind of cynical and sick behavior of our worst enemies. And I'll say that always talk about Tinokot Shel Rabban as
the actions of the fathers are a siman. The actions of the fathers are a siman for the children in both directions.
100%. So you have this interesting midrash quoting these three verses, bringing them together. We can debate exactly how it was that these children were learning these different verses. I've made some suggestions. You've made some suggestions. I think they're all wonderful. But this is apparently a lesson to be learnt, and it provides an inspiration for the prayer Al Tira, which is found in Al Sidur after Aleinu. Now, what we haven't mentioned is what's it got to do with Aleinu. We mentioned perhaps this has nothing to do with Aleinu. Maybe it's to do with the idea that before you leave shul and encounter the wide open world, then you say this prayer. Interestingly, Baruch Halevi Epstein, I didn't bring it here, but he says Aleinu was a source of tension between Jews and non-Jews over the years. And so the reason, therefore, of this being appended to Aleinu is the prayer highlights Jewish-Gentile tensions, and these verses are meant to be a reassurance that when those tensions erupt, it will be okay for the Jews. That's what he says in Baruch She'amar. I think it's interesting. I'd like to offer something slightly more, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but nevertheless rooted in our biblical tradition. And what we have here is an idea of the Vilna Gaon, which is summarized by Rav David Cohen, who is a Rav of Gvul Yavetz in Brooklyn. He wrote and has written many, many books. This is one called Masat Kapai, and he summarizes the Vilna Gaon's idea with great clarity and adds a few extra things as well at the end. And so that's why I'm quoting him rather than the original, although he makes reference to the fact that this is found in Divrei Eliyahu Kol Eliyahu on Megillat Esther. So what does Rav Cohen, really channeling the Vilna Gaon's idea, say? So I'll tell you outside of the text, and I'll read it inside of the text. He says, we have here three verses, one from Mishlei, two from Yeshayahu. What's got one to the other to the other? He says, well, what's interesting is when you look through the Tanakh, there are three major times when Amalek attacks us. You might well say, well, three? He says, yeah, well, when we left Mitzrayim, they attacked us. Asher kar chabaderech. They did so very suddenly, very unexpectedly. Remember how they attacked the vulnerable, the elderly, and the children, like we saw before. There's a second time when Amalek attacks us, where they pretend to be Canaanim. In Parshat Chukat, we have a story where the Canaanim, where V'yishma Canaanim melech Harad, Yoshev Negev, and they come along, Avilachem b'Yisrael. Rashi there explains that really this is Amalek pretending to be the people of Canaan. And that means that sometimes Amalek comes to us with a deceptive manner, not just a sudden manner, but also a deceptive, cunning manner. And there's a third time in the Tanakh, namely Megillat Esther. And he says, I think the three verses of Tira correlate to the three times we encounter Amalek in the Tanakh. So let's see it, and then I've got it presented as a table. I'm going to read it through in the text, and then we'll see the table again. He says, I believe, quoting the Vilna Gaon, that the reason why we say these three verses is based on a certain correlation between Amalek in Tanakh and these three verses. He says, and the Vilna Gaon explains, we find that Amalek comes against Israel three times in the Tanakh. In Beshalach, we were told, straight after we leave Egypt in Refidim. In Parshat Chukat, when they pretend to be the Canaanim, as he quotes there, quoting Rashi, they dressed up. And then he says in the Farshishit, Haman. The third is a case of Haman. And then he says, if you look at those three verses from Tira, they reflect the sentiments of these three moments. So let's go back. Tira pachad pitom. That pitom, that sudden thing, reminds us the way Amalek suddenly encountered us in Refidim. Utsa Eitzav Tufar, these cunning plans remind us of how Amalek pretended to be like the Canaanim in Parshat Chukat. And what's got to do with Vadzikna Anihu Vadseva Niesbol? Here, the verse, God is saying, I'm not going to get old, I'm going to look after you. Or alternatively, you could say, you as a nation, even when you mature, I'll still be with you. There's a midrash in Esther Rabbah elsewhere where we're told that Haman made the claim that God of Israel is tired and old. He says, look at what Nebuchadnezzar was able to do with the Jews. God is tired and old. He can't protect his people. And so the Gaon of Vilna says, this verse relates to that claim by Haman that God is now old and won't protect the Jewish people. And that's what the Gaon says, and that's what Rav David Cohen says. And you may now say, but 1 second, so what's it got to do with Aleinu L'Shabeach? Well, who composed Aleinu L'Shabeach? Asked Rav David Cohen. The answer is, according to the Kolba, it is Yoshua. Yoshua is the one who composed the prayer. Yoshua is the one who began the battles of the Jewish nation against our enemies. And so it makes sense that these pleas, that we overcome Amalek as we encounter it, whichever different state that we do, is appended to the prayer which is composed by the great warrior of Israel, Yoshua bin Nun. And in particular, what is it significant in terms of the final line of Aleinu Shabeach? Because the final line there says, the ultimate time is where God is the king and no other. That means that we are able to overcome all our enemies. So with that in mind, according to the Vilna Gaon, explained by Rav David Cohen, we add these three verses and say, and in order to bring that about, we have to overcome our enemy of Amalek, who in different ways has tried and come to destroy us or harm us or thwart us or hurt us. And God should help us and God should save us. So if you want to see this tabulated, this idea of the Vilna Gaon, I've just made this here. The first verse from Tira correlates to Amalek, this idea of suddenness. The second verse correlates to this Mirma. And the third correlates to the claim by Haman that God is old and tired and can't protect the Jewish nation. Once you understand this, then all of a sudden this prayer is multifaceted. You say this after Aleinu, you relate to the 3 verses from Mishlei and Yeshayahu, which go back to the story of Mordechai and Haman, which itself correlates to 3 different encounters of Amalek, where we encounter Amalek through different means, and we hope by the end of the verse in Aleinu that Hashem should overcome all our enemies, and therefore this is an expression that God do so, especially against our arch enemy Amalek. Any insights or thoughts about that?
Why is there no mention of Shaul against Amalek?
So these are good questions. Again, Rav David Cohen is quoting the Vilna Gaon, and he's seeing this as being the most explicit encounters with the nation of Amalek in terms of them going out against us to harm us.
Well, with Shaul, we went after Amalek. They didn't come after us.
Right.
And this, and the other 3, they're coming after us.
Right. That's how I understand it. Yes. So it's not these aren't the only mentions of Amalek in the Tanakh, but there's 3 times where people have proactively used that energy against the Jewish nation. And so this meditation, these 3 verses, are hopes that they are unsuccessful. Now that we understand these 3 verses and we understand their connection to... Yes, please.
I just thought of something. The second paragraph, if I remember, had to do with Amalek getting dressed in the uniforms or the clothing so that the Jews wouldn't know who to pray against. And that sort of reminded me just now of Hamas and the civilians and everything else.
Yes, I mean, Rashi says explicitly, I have a chumash in front of me actually, that they dressed up as Canaanim and spoke that dialect, so that when the Jews pray and say, let us befall the Canaanim, Amalek wouldn't be included in that, shall we say, curse. And the Am Yisrael had the chokhmah to say, let us just overcome our enemies. And therefore they did. But this idea of dressing up in this very, very, again, cynical and unpleasant way, we have experienced so tragically. So it speaks very much to this hour. I mean, I mean, that's been our prayer since so many centuries and millennia, but certainly in the past 21 months now, towards 21 months, our enemies have dressed in different ways, worn different masks, tried to thwart us in different ways, using the ICC, different governments, different centers, different universities. This is all the Utsa Eight of a Tufar. We basically want Hashem to help us overcome those intentions and those plans and those ploys to harm us. So that verse is right on. I mean, not that the others aren't, but that verse very much speaks to the kind of experiences and dangers that we've seen and witnessed over the past short period of time. Now, I mentioned that in Sidurim, this is found after Aleinu. And we've given a reason why, according to Rav David Cohen, and I mentioned the Baruch Sha'amar, Baruch Halevi Epstein, who gives a different reason. Interestingly, the Taz, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, tells us he did something different. He says, Ani noheg lomar b'chol yom b'shah she'omer, Ashat sim shalom, gimel psukim elu. He would say these 3 verses when they're doing the repetition of the Amidah and they're getting to the prayer for peace. He would mutter these 3 verses. Well, that makes a lot of sense. If we believe that peace is unable to be achieved until our enemies are overcome, then when you're praying for peace, you should also pray that we can overcome our enemies. And so he says, this is when I used to say this prayer. Then he mentioned the Matati Provence. They used to say this every day. So while we can give explanation as to why this is said after Aleinu in the connection with that prayer, and that is a common practice and common custom in terms of its presence in our daily prayer book, the Taz of David Levi Segel used to say it in a different part of this prayer, namely when the Chazan is saying Sim Shalom. But obviously it comes to comes together in the same way. That whole idea, that aspiration that Hashem would bring about peace and unity in the world. I also mentioned, we also said that others have a custom of saying this, not so much being connected to Aleinu, but when you leave the Knesset. So Yaakov Gliss says in Minhagei Eretz Yisrael, Matzati Hinhigu Chachmei Eretz Yisrael, to say this, these three verses, before they leave the shul, meaning this is a pre-leaving shul prayer. It's a school, it's a spiritual tefillat haderech prayer to hope that Hashem makes sure that our enemies don't harm us when we walk out into the wider world. So there was somebody who wants to say something, please.
Yeah, so could the placement just have to do with the fact that it was after they had finished, the Rabbanim had finished writing the Seder, and they didn't want to stick it in any place? They said, okay, we're not going to change the Seder, we're going to put it here?
Could be. Again, it's sometimes very hard to know the exact evolution of the formal prayer book. And sometimes there are prayers which feature in one place and we're not quite sure whether they were already there, always there. We don't even know exactly when this prayer started to be said as a prayer. We know these are three biblical verses. We know they were brought together in the Midrash. We don't exactly know when they came together as a prayer, but once they came together as a prayer, we know that they featured at the end of Aleinu for some, that some said it before they left the shul, but not necessarily at the end of Aleinu. Some people may have said some other prayers and then said this prayer afterwards. And there's a Taz said, and he only lived a few centuries ago, he would say it during Sim Shalom. So the formalization of the place of Tira seems to be a more modern phenomenon with the publication of fixed Sidurim and the accessibility of a certain formal fixed prayer book. But it's hard to know exactly, firstly, which communities did say, which didn't say, and even so, when and where they said this prayer. Even because we did a little brief kind of survey before. Most of us may not necessarily say this prayer, but I can be certain that it's in most of the Sidurim that you have on your shelves. And I'm not here with an agenda to force people to say this prayer, but it's interesting that there is a background, a richness, a history, a meaningfulness of a prayer, which especially in these difficult and scary times, perhaps can speak to us at this hour and give us reassurance and comfort. Any further thoughts before we just pivot to one more idea? Okay, so what I want to do is, I want to now, I'm just moving that over there. I want to now share with you a piece by Rav Kook. Rav Kook wrote many books, or at least he composed many ideas which became many books, of which one is Midot Riyah, really the core teachings and values of Rav Kook, or how he related to core values in Judaism. And there he has a chapter titled Pachdanut, which really means fear or being fearful. Within there, he says something so beautiful. And this, I think, helps us understand how to deal with fear in these difficult times. He says as follows, כל ציורי הפחד הינם רק צבעים פזורים מציור גדול שצריכים להשלימו, ומעלים אותו הם מצטרפים לכולו להמשיך ביטחון גדול ועצום מאוד, הממלא את כל הנפש עוז וגבורה. All images of fear are only scattered colors of a big picture that needs to be completed. When the picture is complete, they join together to elicit a great, tremendous trust, bitachon, that fills the soul with resolve and courage. Isn't that so beautiful? We are fearful when we don't see the big picture. When we only see snapshots of what we're experiencing, then we are understandably scared. These big ballistic missiles are most certainly quite scary. But there's a bigger picture, and that's what faith provides. It enables us to step back and try and make sense of things which are hard to make sense of. To think of Moshe when he stood by the sneh, the burning bush, what does he do? He says, he says, I'm going to move and try and make sense why the bush is not burning. According to Rashi, he steps forward. According to Kli Yakar and others, he steps back. I can talk a lot about that practice. But overall, in this particular case, what Rav Kook is telling us is if we take a step back and realize that the snapshots of the life that we see are mere snapshots and there's a bigger picture, it can help give us reassurance and resolve and courage. And this is explained by Rav Chagai London, and this is kind of like a commentary to Midot Riyah. התחושות הראשונות של הפחד מציגות תמונות חלקיות מפוזרות הגורמות לפחד. The first feelings of fear come as a result of the small snapshots of a bigger picture, which make us worried. He says, think about like an impressionist painting when you only see up close certain parts of picture and things don't necessarily seem to make any sense. You only see just dashes and splashes of certain colors, which don't seem to be comprehensible to you. But once you use your mind to try and bring those different patches together, those different small snapshots of the overall picture, then the fear disappears. אז אותם דימויים מבחילים והם ציורי הפחד מצטרפים לכולו לציור הכולל להמשך ביטחון גדול ועצום מאוד. It helps us foster fear, trust and faith in God. And he says, כאשר אותן תמונות מחרידות מצטרפות למכלול, הן מתקיימות בפרופורציה הראויה בנפש, והאדם מתמלא בביטחון גדול יותר. They give us a sense of proportion, helps us gain a better spiritual footing, and we're filled with trust and reassurance and confidence. So Rav Kook basically tells us, yes, there are moments when we are afraid. And what we need to do is recognize that we are not seeing the whole picture. And once we do, once we realize that there's more to see than meets the eye, then we're able to be reassured. And that's what these three verses do. When you actually go back to these three verses from Mishlei and Yeshayahu, what they're doing is helping us remember that Hashem is with us, that good people will be treated well, that God plans to thwart the plans of evil, and God won't forsake us. And that is a wonderful picture to see. It's a wonderful message to carry. It's an inspiring lesson to learn. And those who say the Tira prayer 3 times a day remind themselves of this message. It makes them feel safe, secure. Obviously, one has to do your own ishtadlut, your own human endeavor. And obviously, there are things which we don't fully understand. These verses don't try and explain what God does. They try and help us make sense of what we can do. So, in principle, this is what I wanted to share with you. I thought maybe we'll say a kapitel Tehillim, a chapter Tehillim together in Achenu. But in terms of my goal for this shiur, I want to talk about faith, fear, and prayer in times of danger, the Tira prayer, how we spiritual wrestle with fear, and how to harness our faith in times of danger. And I think this beautiful prayer found in our Siddur enables us to do so, coaches us to do so, reminds us to do so. And it's something we can lean into. It takes not even a minute to say. And it's a very, very beautiful thing to do. And of course, it reminds us about Mordechai and Esther, reminds us about the turnaround that we saw in Shushan, which again happened on Chaf Gimel Sivan, which is tonight and tomorrow. Reminds us of the kind of geographical area that we're battling right now, of course, as well. So there's a lot of meta overlaps between the Tira prayer and what we're experiencing today. Any final thoughts before we just perhaps say a tefillah and then close?
Just a bit of unrelated or semi-related. Ever since I saw that first line where it says when I turn gray, and I'm thinking, will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? That goes through my head the whole hour.
Well, firstly, I appreciate you sharing it. What's interesting is there is a dual meaning of going old, because the classical mafarshim on that pasuk refer to God speaking to Am Yisrael, that when you, Am Yisrael, get older, meaning as you mature as a nation, I won't forsake you. Whereas Haman, as I mentioned, uses this as a critique of God, as if to say God has now gotten old and God isn't able to sustain you. But faith is about knowing that God doesn't age. And love, which is what we're supposed to have with God, is also about remembering that love doesn't age. Am Yisrael have had this remarkable covenant with God for thousands of years. It doesn't age like love. And it, in fact, arguably it gets better over time. And that's, I think, the message of those verses. And imagine that being the final verse you say every morning before you start your day. Isn't that a beautiful thing? And like I'm really, really inspired by this prayer because it carries so much symbolism. It conveys so much beautiful comfort and trust and faith. So yeah, even when we're 64 and 74 and 84, Hashem is with us.
One thing I've noticed is if you're in an Ashkenaz shul, especially in Israel, that Aleinu is not the end. You've got Shir Shal Yom, then you've got Enkelahenu, and then you've got Durban and Kadesh. So perhaps you say Al Tira at the end of all that. And the second thing I always found that Aleinu ends with this wonderful Hashem Bayamahu Hashem Echad, this wonderful uplift. And I've always felt that Al Tira sort of brought me down a little bit. So perhaps I'm going to say Al Tira at the end of everything as I go out into the world, because I've been lifted up by Aleinu, and rather than coming down again, I'm going to leave Al Tira to the very end.
Well, I think Al Tira is meant to lift you, but I hear the sentiment as mentioned here in Minhag Eretz Israel. It says that they used to say before they were just leaving the Beit Knesset, so that's aligned with the custom, seemingly in certain communities here. I don't think we are fixed absolutely in the Mikum. I mentioned Rav Baruch Levi Epstein and and Rav David Cohen explaining the association with Aleinu, but as I said, it's Lav Davka. That's not the crucial thing. And the Taz already says it's a different place. So especially when Aleinu is not the last thing and other people are moving on, maybe now isn't necessarily the right time. But I think perhaps now, in terms of this period in Jewish history, is a good time to start this, if you so wish. You mentioned Hail. Again, I remember being there that Shabbat when Rabbi Portnoy instituted saying Al Tira. This was when there were lots of attacks taking place in Israel. And he said, I'd like to suggest that we as a community do something. The community agreed. And it's actually, they don't just read these words, they sing it. Al Tira mi pachat pitom, v'sol v'shoim ki tavo, it's actually a nice tune. So for those of you who have yet to hear that tune, I'm sure you may be able to find it somewhere. And if not, Rabbi Joel Portnoy instituted that in his shul in Hale community. Final thoughts before we just say a chapter Tehillim and finish. Okay, so let's do that as you wish, but it seems appropriate. We've still got difficult times. So like many shuls, they finish with a parak Tehillim. Shalom alo, mamakim kraticha Adonai. Adonai shema b'koli, tieno zachar kashuvod, lo kol tachnunai. Im avonot tishmoria, Adonai mi yamod. Kimcha slicha leman tivarei. Kimcha slicha leman. קביתי אדוני כיפתה נפשי, לא אוכלתי, נפשי לאדוני ושומעים לבוקר, שומעים לבוקר, וכן ישראל אדוני, כי אם אדוני חסד בהרבה מופדות, ואוהב את ישראל מכל עוונותיו. And we will end with אחינו כל בית ישראל נתונים בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה, המקום ירחם עליהם יוצאי מצר לברכה, מעפר לאורה משברות לגאולה, השתה בהגנה בזמן קריב ונאמר אמן.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining. It's so nice having you here. Thank you so much for joining our shiurim at WebYeshiva.org. As mentioned, we have many shiurim, many classes, many courses, and there's also the spiritual coaching and halachic consultation. If you want to find out more, you know where to find us. Look after yourselves, stay well, stay safe, and thank you again for joining.
Rabbi Johnny
Rabbi.
for enlightening me in something I knew about but never said properly. Thank you very much. It was fascinating.
We never said this in any shul I've been to, So for me, I had to go looking for it, and I'm going to add this to my daily stuff.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Toda rabba.
B'simcha rabba. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Tira.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Be
Brian.
safe, everybody.
Be
Yeah.
safe. Take care,
safe.
everyone.
Keep the
Well,
smiles on.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thank
Amen.
you.
And
Thank you, everyone.
Rabbi, my
Yes.
19-year-old cat, who's been with Web Yeshiva for as long as I have, is also here today.
Wonderful. Beautiful.
Literally, he's going to be 19 next month, and he started Web Yeshiva the same time that I did.
Well, you know,
Like-
every 19 years, so Hebrew and English and secular birthday come together. So it's a real special occasion. Wish your cat well. Happy
Well,
birthday.
he's right here next to me. I think he's there when I turned the camera on a couple of times.
Take care, everyone. Look after yourselves.
Be well. Have a safe,
Bye-bye.
safe week, people. Bye-bye.
Amen.
Bye.
Bye-bye.